I'm LAYMAN PASCAL, and this is a special feature of the Meta Theory series on the Integral Stage. Today we'll be in conversation with two of my favorite thinkers, Gregg Henriques and Steve McIntosh, to examine the intersections and resonances between emerging ideas about wisdom energy and value energy. My own view is that any comprehensive definition of wisdom has to have value, or what I would call the metacognitive adjudication of the interactions between values, at its heart. And I want to encourage both these guys to go further down the pathways of thinking that they've been exploring. Let's start with each of them slightly introducing their concept. Let's start with you, Steve. Maybe you could give us a sense of what you mean when you say value energy.
Okay, sure. Well, this idea, I've been thinking about it for over a decade now. It started with the explorations in my book, Evolution's Purpose, which came out in 2012. And they're examining the structure of evolutionary emergence and the inputs and throughputs that were driving the upward current of that structure of emergence. I came to see how life, one of the main things that distinguishes life from non-life, is that life has this purpose to survive and reproduce. Right, the famous biologist Lynn Margulis kind of summarized it as life is matter that chooses. And so this choice to survive and reproduce, where's that coming from? You know, is it completely generated within the genetic instincts of the organism? Or is there something beyond the organism, such as a meal or a mate, you know, or the preservation of their existence that they're striving for? What's driving? How can we understand the striving of all life, and indeed how that striving jumps to a new level with the emergence of humanity, right? That is the difference in the ability to see how things could be better, the ability to define what the good, the true, and the beautiful is, that emerges at a higher level with humanity. So just starting with life, the conception that I used in 2012 was this idea of value gravity. That surviving and reproducing is a primitive form of goodness that attracts life at every level, sort of attracts it from the inside. So that concept I developed further in Developmental Politics, my 2020 book, where I thought that while I still think the idea of value gravity is useful, I think a more apt analogy is value magnetism. In other words, the electromagnetic spectrum in the physical universe exhibits a physics of behaviors, including the way electricity moves in a circuit, the way all living systems metabolize physical energy. For the last 150 years, humanity has been discovering the physics of energy and trying to understand what it is in itself. And that's, there's still lots of mystery, even though there's this kind of hand waving like, oh, just we're calling it energy. There's still, I think, even physical science and physics, there's still mystery that they may not be willing to admit in their understanding of what the nature of energy is and how it functions in the universe. But I put a lot of weight on the quote from Ralph Waldo Emerson, where he says that every natural fact is a symbol of some spiritual fact. Another way to put that was as above, so below. So when we're bringing in this idea of the internal universe of consciousness and intersubjective culture into our understanding of evolution, we can begin to understand how there's this energy flow that is the physical fact of natural physical energy is in some ways a mirror of something similar that's occurring in the realm of consciousness, both in animals and humans. And that is this attraction to value, this gentle persuasion that occurs first with life and then in a more dramatic and complete way with humanity. And that attraction to value is sort of what helps to create the structure of emergence in the noosphere, right? That is each worldview, if we want to use worldviews or value system as some of the key markers of this structure of emergence in consciousness and culture, then we can say that these worldviews, in a sense, act as channels of value at a particular level, right? They're defined by the horizon of potential improvement. And so as humans awaken to new conceptions of value, wider estimates of those worthy of moral consideration, wider estimates of what's true, right? Even greater aesthetic sophistication. These steps of value realization are being drawn by a kind of a magnetic attraction to a better way. And so this conception of value as energy is validated not only in the way that it draws consciousness from the inside at every level, but also in the way we can begin to exhibit, we could see that there's something equivalent to physics in the realm of value, like the way values cohere in these interdependent polarities, like that almost every value and things that create value seem to be naturally related to each other in these interdependent constructs that mirror this pattern of part and whole, which I explain, in depth. It's a little hard to land, just in a wrap in a podcast, but we can certainly unpack it some. So what value is in itself is its own interesting philosophical inquiry, which you can also unpack. But let me stop there and let Gregg jump in and you and see where maybe we can kind of find an intersection of discourse where we can begin to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, great overview, Steve. Gregg, what about you? When you're thinking of wisdom energy, what are you thinking towards?
Great. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I can jump off of that. The actual intersection of these two concepts in my head is only about 3 weeks old. So, but it is a manifestation of a direction, a calling, a magnetism, perhaps. And so for me, I believe that we can think about the ultimate common denominator in the universe being energy. Sort of the idea that the universe begins as a pure energy singularity is appealing to me. And then you have an unfolding and a differentiation. And following our line, you get a negentropic force at some level, right? An accumulation of complexity that's fighting against the entropy forces of stochastic distribution. And then you get a real jump at the level of life. And at the level of life, you get these proto-cognitive systems that have the capacity to store information, capture free energy, autopoietic development, and attractor states, right, towards survival and reproductive success. I then see a very similar jump in the level of animal. So just like the cell has a nucleus and a DNA, RNA, protein structure, we have a multicellular structure coordinated by a nervous system. And I developed a meta theory of mind-brain behavior called behavioral investment theory. And the argument is that nervous system is an investment value system that expends work energy in a particular direction. And then ultimately, pleasure and pain serve as nature's markers for good and bad at the animal kingdom, sets the stage for operant learning. And then that operant learning then sets the stage for much more complicated deliberative processes that we see in birds and mammals. And then we see another jump from primates into people. And that is when we start this intersubjective processing, what I identify as justification systems theory. This language opens up an intersubjective highway. And that creates all sorts of wonderful opportunities for syncing our minds, but it also creates what I call the problem of justification, which basically is, hey, how do we determine what's true analytically, like what corresponds to the states of affairs if I say the antelope are over there, and then what corresponds to our social interests and my personal interests. So the problem of justification activates these truth claims and then social and personal interest claims. That then drives the evolution both of macro level cultural systems across various domains. And I trace this in terms of the evolution of cultural consciousness very similarly, I think, to you. I talk about an oral indigenous mindset. I talk about then a traditionalist mindset, a modernist mindset, a postmodernist mindset. And I believe the evolution of that cultural consciousness can very much be thought of as evolution of systems of justification. And one of the key attractors around that is issues towards foundational values. I think we see that. And I actually emphasize things like dignity, well-being, and integrity as particular kinds of values. I saw, your intersection, which I thought was really brilliant and beautiful. Obviously, there's good, true, beautiful. And I actually correspond dignity, well-being, and integrity with that. And then the cultivation of virtues in relation. All of that actually is very consistent with my frame. And ultimately, what I have been working on recently is sort of a synergy between our knowledge systems and being. And that was the jump then from back into energy, wisdom, energy, the transformation of our knowledge systems back into being with each other, being with the planet, and being in right relation to, say, ultimate concern. And that transformation then for me, I captured by the cultivation of wisdom energy. And that was sinking for me over the last 3 weeks.
Right on. Well, Layman, why don't you take us where you want us to go?
You know, since we're still near the beginning, I'd really like to take the opportunity to consider whether or not energy is just a really good comprehensive metaphor, or whether you guys think there's some potential, maybe down the road a ways, of quantifying these kinds of processes in the way that energy was quantified over the last, say, 1,000 years of scientific effort, of making some kind of abstract consistency of the doingness of the phenomenon. Steve, do you think value energy, is it even within the realm of possibility to quantify it, to make it more like traditional scientific energies? Or is that just always going to be a useful abstract metaphor?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. I think that in the same way that you know, going back to Emerson's idea of the natural fact and the spiritual fact, I think that we can see part of the evidence for anything going on in the internal universe, that they're you know, and I'm not sure about this, so I don't want to state it as a categorical statement, but it seems like we would expect to find traces in the physical universe of real motions and real movements toward a better state of affairs in the internal universe, right? So that as your consciousness evolves, that wires up new parts of your brain, right? Or as culture evolves, we can see new artifacts, new physical manifestations of that culture, just language itself. As language evolves and our meaning relationships evolve, new words appear, right? The number of words in the language expands. So I think in that same way that if we're talking about something real and it manifests primarily in the internal universe of consciousness and culture, then I think that our theory would point to the fruitfulness of looking for physical manifestations, but I would also want to resist the need to quantify things completely. Just like neuroscience would like to use a PET scan to map all of the neurological activity that's going on in your physical brain and try to map that on a one-to-one basis to what's going on in your mind. But I think that the most advanced levels of neuroscience have given up on the project of trying to find a one-to-one correspondence, or that you could somehow read someone's PET scan and know, you know, you might be able to read their PET scan and know they're hungry, or know that they're horny, or know that there's some basic biological thing that brain state corresponds to. But if they're thinking about the good, the true, and the beautiful, or the love for their family, or something that's at a much higher order, I mean, while we could maybe trace things in the physical brain, I resist the idea that we can find a one-to-one correspondence, or that for every occurrence or ideation in the internal universe, there must be a corresponding level of complexity in the physical universe. And the key thing that disproves that, is that our minds have evolved significantly over the last 40,000 years, but the physical structures of our brains have not evolved appreciably at all. I mean, we may have new wiring in our new electrical connections that correspond to that higher level of consciousness. But the brain's not evolving in the same way that culture and consciousness are evolving. And so therefore I wouldn't want to put too much weight on quantification and maybe see it as like we could see a quantifiable shadow, but the shadow's not the real thing. It's just a reflection of it at a lower level.
What about you, Gregg? How close can wisdom energy come to the way energy is used and conceived of and metricized in the physical sciences?
Yeah, that's a great question. So for me, I'm a universal behaviorist. So I actually think, I don't think in terms of like matter per se, but I think in terms of different dimensions of behavioral complexity, one of which is the material universe. And you cannot, and I see life, mind, and culture, my dimensions of complexity, as superimposed based on the way in which information processing and communication structures give rise to complex adaptive behavior patterns. So you cannot reduce, in my opinion, the structure, the informational and communication and behavioral structure of life to chemicals. So you can't do that kind of one-to-one correspondence because they operate at different levels and dimensions of analysis. At the same time, there is a work, energy, effort production that's required to maintain what the organism does, metabolism, for instance. And then you can describe the kinds of energy processes that are unfolding, like, oh, that's metabolism, that's metabolic energy, okay? And then I can then look at the various behaviors that animals do. So like, that's aggressive energy, all right? Now, how to do that in relation is definitely complicated. We see what Freud tries to do it in a particular kind of way, like hydraulics, and be like, okay, and we know that there's an information component that he misses and then tries to turn it into a hydraulic thing. And at the same time, there's certainly something to be said by the notion of drives orienting in a particular way that have some analogous element. If we go up to wisdom energy, for me, what I exit very much like what you said about what kind of activity, state of being, doing and becoming is wisdom. Well, it's a state of mind that's metacognitively reflective, that's grounded in foundational values like goodness, truth, and beauty, etc., and then is applied in a particular way that's reflective, thoughtful, and oriented toward valued states of being over time. And then if you say, well, what we were trying to do is to evolve into maximizing the capacity for individuals, groups, nations to enter, do, be, and become in that state, well, then I would say, oh, that's what I mean, that the properties of that energy manifestation are wisdom, and we want to cultivate wisdom energy in that regard.
So we don't want to be too reductionistic in terms of thinking about these energies purely in terms of the basic physical energies used in the sciences. But we could go a little ways toward that in terms of thinking of quantity in very basic terms. So, Steve, what constitutes more or less value? How would it be increased or decreased?
Sure. Well, that goes to my explorations regarding the ontology of value. What is this thing, right? We start with Plato and his forms, trying to make value objective. That doesn't work, right? There's all kinds of huge philosophical blows landed against Plato's theory of value being simply given as eternal forms, right? Then we see in history the movement of first the empiricists, then the existentialists declaring the opposite of Plato, that value is not objective, that it's merely subjective, right? That it's just our choices and our preferences, and we create value by our choosing, and that there is no value in the universe. The universe is simply devoid of value. It's absurd. And whatever value is in the universe is what we project on it or give to it. And obviously that, as I write and as others write, is equally partial. Just like we can't, declare it objective, to declare the opposite and say that it's simply subjective has all kinds of philosophical problems as well. So how can we get our arms around this thing which requires the unification of the subjective and the objective, using those categories? Not that we want to put too much weight on them, but in other words, that there's an experiential being that participates in the value creating experience, but that experience is not completely solipsistically contained within that experiencing individual's mind. There's something out there that's more valuable, as we talked about in a previous podcast. So how do we get our arms around what this thing? I mean, it's palpable. We if you talk to an average person about the good, the true, and the beautiful, they're not going to say, well, that's just some silly metaphysical concept, which I don't think is real. Everybody, there's something good and true and beautiful for everyone, regardless of their level of development. So I would say, okay, we're talking about something real. It's slippery. We can't contain it within the subjective, nor cleanly land it in an objective. So the philosophical conception that I come to is that value in itself can be understood as the movement toward perfection, the movement toward the good, the increase in the consciousness. So, like, for example, Alfred North Whitehead, he defined evolution overall as an increase in the ability to experience what's intrinsically valuable. It's a consciousness-centric definition of evolution, with the idea that the sensitive center, or the object of what is Whitehead called it, the occasion of experience, that is itself what's evolving, and what constitutes the membrane or the container that's growing that contains that occasion of experience is the horizon of value which that experience can take in. So as we, that sounds pretty highfalutin, but it grounds out when we say, how do we make the world a better place? We make it more good, true, and beautiful. So then we come to see these concepts as directions of evolution, the essential intrinsic directions of evolution that is sort of validated by our own teleology, for our own purpose for the good, the true, and the beautiful. The humans throughout history, as soon as they manifest one level of goodness, truth, and beauty, or dignity, or justice, or we could throw in a whole bunch of words.
Sure.
Then once they manifest that, they awaken to a higher level, right? That's sort of this degree of freedom that allows us to imagine how things could be better at a whole new level. We improve our definition of improvement itself, and that's how we evolve. So if we understand value as the experience of moving toward that which is more perfect, or that which is better, we can begin to get our hands around how we can be both objective and subjective at the same time. And that opens up all kinds of possibilities. I mean, the reason that I'm interested in this stuff, not just for its own intellectual interestingness, I'm working on a think tank trying to evolve consciousness and culture, in America and beyond. And one of the key components of this work philosophically is to understand how political will is formed, right? How can we strengthen political will in America to combat climate change? What are the pragmatic obstacles to that? Well, this theoretical, philosophical understanding of the nature of value itself and how it's pulling on us, how it occurs in stages, etc. That's extremely useful in the very pragmatic political task of learning how to cultivate political will, learning how to gently persuade and build movements in a way that can make the world a better place and address, what some people like to call the crisis. And so, this way of thinking is very important. And we're just arriving at a place in history where we have the ability to think in these terms. And while they reach all the way up to the heights of human understanding, they also reach all the way down to the political problems of our, difficult time in history.
Gregg, same question. What would characterize more or less when it comes to wisdom energy?
Great. Yeah, very. So if I tag on to what Steve says, so for me, there's the objective, subjective, and then the intersubjective. And for me, then the intersubjective connects to our systems of justification. So other animals have some implicit intersubjective, clearly mother, offspring, and they relate to each other and they form attachments and things like that. That's an implicit relational dance, very crucial. And we as primates hold that, and that creates a phenomenological shared sense of subjective being, and we then have to participate in the world. But ultimately, when we jump into propositional statements, then all of a sudden that, like I said, people start to be able to make propositional statements and then question propositional statements. That opens up negative space, and you get this really interesting dialectic of what is the propositions that we should network together and create systems of justification around. And then I argue there's truth problems, there's social problems, and personal problems. And I think that if you then attend to, if systems of justification then evolve, they'll do better and better at getting more sophisticated accounts of what's true and getting better and better at sophisticated accounts of harmonizing personal social values in a particular way. And then what you see is potentially the growth of evolution ideally the hope for growth of evolutionary cultural consciousness, for example. What are we aspiring for? Well, we're trying to help people cultivate good, true, beautiful. We look at the Nazi horror and like, oh my God, that is exactly the opposite. It's a series of lies that destroy people and create untold suffering. and it makes your whole felt sense. If you have any empathy, as long as you're not a psychopath, if you have any empathetic capacity whatsoever, and thankfully 95 to 99% of us, as long as we're raised in pretty good state, will have that intuitive foundational and emotional investment value system. And to the extent we can build justifications and then participate in that with a particular sense of shared, we can be our authentic selves, get acknowledged for that in a particular way, and create a metacognitive system, then we can cultivate the good, true, and beautiful and see more of it as opposed to see it contract and see less of it.
Steve, when you and I first talked about this, I then wrote a little document explaining how the same model could be done in a Nietzschean fashion. He tried to think the subjective correlate of energy and called that an empowerment drive, where energy is fundamentally trying to integrate and discharge and to have a subjective experience of intensified being in that process. And if you let that universe iterate for a long time, it will eventually stabilize ways to do that at higher levels of quantitative and qualitative intensity. But there's something that's consistent all the way through, whether we're talking about the discharge of electromagnetism or the activity of an amoeba or elaborate human cultural and spiritual affairs. It's hard to tease apart what makes values different and what makes them all the same. And I think that comes forward really apparently in the case of someone who hacks their own psychological system to produce an experience of perfection. So somebody engaged in a particular religious practice might specialize in changing their own thinking in electromagnetism and chemistry so that they experience a maximum degree of perfection. Are they at the peak of value? Is that the best anyone can do? Or is there a way of saying to that person, that's still not enough, even though you're maxing it out?
Sure. Well, that's a great query. I think to get our arms around that question of what makes value the same across the entire spectrum of emergence, that's why I think one of the extremely important reasons why our efforts to actually come up with a map of the structure of emergence that is that's sophisticated, but also not so unwieldy that we can't use it and apply it to things like generating political will. So we see, of course, we have the Big Bang, right? That seems to be pretty well established with different pillars of evidence that the universe, that time and space and matter and energy flares forth from a singularity 13.8 billion years ago, right? And then we have the debris of the Big Bang, which is basically mostly hydrogen gas with a little bit of helium. And so gradually over time, the helium and the hydrogen start to interact. They produce the periodic table of elements. We have the micro and the macro of cosmological evolution, right? Then we have the second Big Bang. Holmes Ralston is done some very important work in this area. His book, Three Big Bangs, published by Columbia University Press, is particularly illuminating about the structure of emergence. And I got a lot out of that. Life represents a kind of a second Big Bang because it brings in a new type of evolution, right? Life is a river that runs uphill, right? The negative entropy characteristics of life constitute, in a sense, a new ontological category that enters the universe, right? And so that's what makes it a second Big Bang. And in the same way that the first Big Bang is not explained, neither is the evolution of life. I mean, the DNA molecule itself is a flippin' miracle. It's like it's a large set of encyclopedias with its own reader. Where does that come from? It's still not explained, and it certainly can't and never will be explained by entirely materialistic, metaphysics. But nevertheless, second Big Bang, the reason that the amazing sequences of emergence that occur within the biosphere can all be contained within the biosphere, even though, the emergence of multicellular life and the Cambrian explosion, these are all giant events, of course, but they're still within this second domain of evolution. The technique of evolution for all of life, from, amoebas to great apes, is basically this process of natural selection. Right? So even though it's getting more complex and there's these major events of emergence, the domain of evolution is not transcended until we come to the third Big Bang, which is the emergence of humans, wherein a new ontological reality enters the universe that didn't exist before. And this is this dimension of freedom, right? So what some people call free will. And of course, no will is freestanding. But the idea that we have the creativity and the imagination and indeed the freedom to imagine how things could be better and continuously improve the human condition over thousands and thousands of years, it's inaugurated a new domain of evolution that proceeds by a different technique, right? It's no longer natural selection that's driving the evolution of the noosphere. It's actual selection. People are trying to make the world a better place. They're trying to solve their existential problems. So that's why it's important, I think, to have this essential frame of the three major domains of evolution and not fall victim to the confusion that occurs from a materialistic point of view, as, for example, David Christensen does in his Big History, right? Because he's got these blinders on that are trying to fit everything that he's saying into a materialistic metaphysical frame. He can't tell the difference because he's missing the essential new ontological emergences. He's missing the what's unique about humans and what's unique about life. And so these levels of emergence are confused, but I think it's natural. So let me say one more thing, and that is, I believe that what's coming after this postmodern progressive phase is a kind of a second enlightenment. It can be compared in a way as a return on the spiral to something that is equivalent to the emergence of modernity in the Enlightenment. And one of the main projects at the beginning of modernity was to map the world, right? The age of discovery. The project was mapping the world, and it took them a long time, right? At first the world, was flat, and then they knew it was a sphere, but they thought it was smaller, and then they had some crude maps, but California was drawn as an island, and gradually things got more and more accurate. And I think now in this second enlightenment, we're entering a new age of discovery where the project is the cartography of the internal universe, right? We're trying to map what that looks like. And that involves understanding how the structure of emergence continues, right? So what's the same is that there's this structure of emergence that starts with hydrogen atoms and goes all the way up to where we are now. And those aren't just events of the distant past. Those events of emergence are occurring right now in our bodies, right? Hydrogen is the most numerous atom in our bodies. It makes up our water molecules, and water is the main ingredient of our bodies. And so the achievement of the creation of the hydrogen atom, that initial emergence, is online and functioning in this larger structure of emergence, which we embody. And so when we say, okay, how are we approaching the edge of evolution in the noosphere? Well, it's in this new worldview that we're birthing, this new horizon of justification, this new frame of the beautiful, the true, and the good that moves in a very important direction of inclusion, right? One of the moral lines that we can say that we can judge whether something's more evolved or less evolved is how much does it include, right? That's why one of the reasons that an objective marker of cultural evolution that even the most relativistic progressives have a hard time refuting is the idea that when women become equal to men, when a society includes women and men in the opportunities that the society affords, that's a more evolved society. We can say in absolute terms that the more equal women are, to a large extent, the more evolved the society is. And that's tracing this line of inclusion. So we're trying to extend the structure of emergence. I think that's the essential integral project. And so getting a map of micro and macro and internal and external and trying to bring it all together, it's a massive intellectual project. And those who are intuitively drawn to it, like Richard Dreyfuss with his mashed potatoes, making the Devil's Tower and the Close Encounters. I think all three of us are a little bit like that. We're being drawn to this opportunity to map the structure of emergence. But one of the ideational sort of conditions of poverty that we exist in, and there's all these people thinking about it, but they're also snobby, and there's all this kind of narcissism of small differences where they can't recognize each other. David Christensen's never even heard of Holmes Ralston. Holmes Ralston's never even heard of Ken Wilber, right? Everybody's in their little silos, and they look at each other and poo-poo each other, and that's a tragedy. So I think, overcoming the intellectual fashion that puts people in these little silos and allows their metaphysical commitments to constrain their ability to recognize fellow travelers in this grand project, I think is one of the barriers we need to break down and start sharing each other's knowledge and taking each other seriously.
So thinking about moving towards this new cartography, I think should put us in mind of the kinds of skills and tools that the map makers of tomorrow will require. And I think about this a lot in terms of proto skills or primitive capacities. So, Greg, what do you think are the root capacities that allow us to distinguish wise organization of information from merely knowledge or adaptive skill gaining in a particular niche?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, you said a lot there, Steve, that I can respond to. First, I want to respond to your final point as absolutely essential. The narcissism of small differences, the attachment to the scheme as truth and what we get socialized to in the academy, that knowledge is everything, and then the ontological pristineness of your claims are everything, and then you battle, and then you create your silos, and you get your doctoral students, and they fall in line. I think that we have got to fundamentally change that culture and make an integrative pluralism that appreciates a felt sense of sensibility of fellow travelers and bring people together that says that, hey, that can ground in practice, to get to your point, Layman, to ground in practice the capacity to be together, to share the versions of reality and worldviews that we have, to be resonant with the remarkable amount of overlap, and then enjoy the potential differences, be clear about what they are, and celebrate the fact that, oh, we're still in the process of trying to figure this thing out. How else could we be, right? And so, I'm a clinical psychologist, so I spend a lot of time dealing with people's wounded egos. My friend Cadell Last has a great line in his, as a signature line, is that die again, die better. And I want our egos to die again and die better on this journey. I think that can free us up from sort of clinging to particular, specified points. I do think these specified points can be very important, and they're worthy of, a deep analysis. But at the same time, they shouldn't fracture us to the point where the message is lost in relationship to transforming. You talked about an Enlightenment 2.0. That's exactly the way I think about where we are, what I believe the earth needs, what I believe globalization needs, what I believe our relationship to ourselves and our wives and our husbands and our children need desperately, is a fundamental transformation about the relationship of our human souls and this planet and our knowledge systems. So I would offer that. I would say, who can, we want individuals to bring that. We want to socialize people and develop people to do that. And if you bring that capacity, the participatory, curious, accepting, loving, compassionate, motivated to learn as you share what you know, frame of reference, I think that will be, well, that will cultivate some wisdom energy, and disperse it. Yeah. One comment I will make, and then to get into sort of, and then open up, the tree of knowledge system that I constructed actually argues for 4 big bangs very explicitly. So you go matter, life, and then it argues that the animal kingdom and the nervous system is actually a whole nother big bang. And it's the operant learning system that actually then is the root of phenomenological consciousness in the animal kingdom. And so that the animal kingdom is as different from bacteria than as we are from primates. So it's a whole nother jump. So I model it as 4 big bangs. And I argue that the logic of that, both in terms of the behavioral complexity of, say, animals relative to bacteria, I also argue that you can see it in relationship to these information processing and communication systems, genetics, neuronal, language. And I also argue that if you have that distinction, you can do what my field, psychology, has never been able to do. You can actually start making some sense out of the crazy field of the science of psychology.
Well, so let me ask you then, my argument is that the evolution of eukaryotes and the evolution of primates are still operating according to the same evolutionary regime. In other words, it's still natural selection. Yep. And they're still, that as amoebas have, even though they may not have neurons, they still have purpose, right? They're still minimal molecular autonomous agents, as Stuart Kaufman says, right? And so, I mean, again, this is rather, this point maybe is something we could agree to disagree on, but I mean, at what point do you see the big bang of this huge separation between, less complex life and more complex life?
Yeah, with the Cambrian explosion, basically the emergence of the coordinated systems of the sensory aspects of the nervous system and the motor aspects of the nervous system get plugged into a complex active body. And then you get an online behavioral selection learning system that can engage in its own lifetime evolution through operant conditioning behavior, what B.F. Skinner calls behavioral selection. So you get a 3-tier model, you get natural selection, then that programs in, and obviously there's some responsivity as dynamic systems of life. And I believe they have protocognition and a capacity to adjust. But the pleasure pain operant learning system that generates the law of effect that you see in complex active animals, and then that sets the stage for phenomenological consciousness of experience that I believe that other animals share. They felt experience, pleasure, pain, perception, motives. All of that stuff represents another universe of being, as far as my system would suggest.
I recently saw something, I can't remember where, but it was sort of a little mini documentary about the amazingness of slime molds.
Yep.
Which I believe are Precambrian organisms.
Oh yeah, that absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And that the slime mold does learn. That there many of these things which we previously attributed to post-Cambrian organisms are observable in these interesting Precambrian structures.
There definitely is. Yeah, no, and certainly this is, the bottom line is that I think the nervous system still is a game changer. Slime molds do a lot of unbelievably cool things, and we're learning about the intelligence of trees. We're learning about the remarkable capacity of the organismic kingdom. But the nervous system, for me, the way it yokes together animals and then engages them in a particular way, the behavior of a dog is fundamentally different than anything we see in the non-animal kingdom.
Yeah, sure. I mean, that's pretty self-evident. So I mean, again, we can the theoretical differences there are, I don't think they make much difference in the larger scheme of what we're trying to achieve, in this conversation and in our work.
Right.
Bring the idea of the structure of emergence into people's minds.
100%. For me, as a psychological scientist, what I argue is that if you yoke together B.F. Skinner's key insights with a neurocognitive view of the nervous system, you can then really see the foundation of animal behavior and how it emerges out of life. Basically lateral in terms of the fundamentally different kinds of learning and experiential consciousness that then is driven by that. And that is a different complex adaptive plane of existence in my view of the world. Sure. And so, yeah.
Well, let me just try to, I was hoping, Layman, we could go back to the subject of intersubjectivity. Right, because that's particularly juicy, and I think all three of us have some good thinking there. According to Wilber's quadrant model, right, that shows the lower left domain of ontological intersubjectivity. According to his model, it goes all the way down, right, that even subatomic particles have intersubjective relations. And while I have my objections to Wilber's model, I think the strongest part of it is this robust unveiling of intersubjectivity as a domain of evolution, which is not entirely subjective nor completely objective, right? That is the I, the it, and the we, this idea of we as an evolutionary space. So one of the things I mentioned at the end, the Appendix A in Developmental Politics, where I take on developmental psychology and try to unpack ontological intersubjectivity a little bit more, is I cite this field in academia, which has recently become hot, and that is what's called social ontology. So if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they have this relatively new, it's only a couple years old, major article that's published and curated by this professor at Stanford, whose name I forget, but there's about 600 citations in this Stanford Encyclopedia article about all the different explorations of social ontology and what that means. And while they have this basic idea of intersubjectivity, They're trying like hell. They're bending themselves into pretzels to not give it any ontological status. In other words, it's just like this kind of like this inchoate wedding to materialism that just keeps flattening even though they all know social ontology is real, that there's something going on here that we can't make into a material thing. And yet, it's impoverished. And of course, there's of the 600 citations in this Stanford Encyclopedia article, Wilbur's work's not mentioned, right? Holmes Ralston's not mentioned. So again, there's this siloing. But I think there is definitely an intellectual hunger for a greater understanding of intersubjectivity and what it means to build and develop the we. And so maybe we can explore that for a minute.
Yes. Do you think subjective and intersubjective value operate in the same way, or do they have distinctions?
Well, if I define value as a movement toward perfection, right? So again, let me unpack that term for a second, because it's important to our concept of value. The evolving universe is getting more complex, right? So materialists like to say that the evolution is moving in the direction of complexity. But that's only half the story, because as organisms become more complex, they also become more unified, right? So, a starfish is complex, but you can cut off its leg and it grows a new starfish, right? Whereas a squirrel is much more unified. If you cut off the squirrel's leg, it's not going to survive in the wild, right? So, sorry for the squirrels, but the idea that complexity is one line, but it's also connected to the line of unity and the line of consciousness itself, that as complexity increases, this was Teilhard de Chardin's big breakthrough understanding, is that complexity and consciousness evolve together, right? He just didn't bring in that third leg of unity. And I try to unpack those lines in my 2007 book, Integral Consciousness. But when I'm talking about moving toward perfection, what I'm talking about is that as these sequences of emergence unfold in the universe, and as consciousness appears and becomes more complex and embarks in its own domain of evolution, as we've discussed, this noosphere evolution, we're moving in a palpable direction, right? I mean, we can say that it's linear because it traces the arrow of time, but of course we can't try to force fit it into a linear conception. Whatever it is, we know it's not linear. That there's many different lines, and that there may be a larger structure. The spiral is fairly elegant, but even the spiral, is overly linear in our force fitting of that concept. But we know that things are, in a sense, that consciousness is evolving in the universe. We can say that, I think, with relative certainty, and that as consciousness evolves, one of the markers of its evolution is how beautiful, true, and good it is, or at least how much it's striving. It's not what you are, but what you're striving to become in a way that defines you. And so the universe is moving, and as I argue at length in The Presence of the Infinite, my 2015 book, that we can see that there's one way of conceiving this, one speculative way of conceiving this, is that we have the finite universe, but that this finite universe of becoming is, in a sense, situated with a larger, more infinite universe of being. So this concept of being and becoming is a useful way to try to understand where the finite universe is going, where evolution is going. What's the existential reason for the finite universe? What does it add to existential perfection or infinity? And if we conceive of the finite universe as a domain in which, the elements of infinity, including, eternity, infinity, perfection, all of the things that make something completely whole and not capable of being improved, that the finite universe is adding the experience of becoming perfect. The opportunity for the creatures themselves to discern by their own lights what's relatively more good, true, and beautiful. And that if we begin to see that that's where evolution is indeed moving, and that we're the bearers of that teleology, we don't have to bring in intelligent design or a loving creator to get to that idea. We can simply say, look, humanity is here. We're proof of what the universe wants. And so our purposes are its purposes. Our purposes for the beautiful, the true, and the good are helping to discern and define the direction of evolution itself. So if we're conceiving that as the movement toward perfection, and if we perceive as perfection as a kind of a gravity of time and consciousness in the finite universe, then the word concept goodness, we can think of it as a plumb line, right? Just like gravity has a plumb line that's very useful if you're building things and want to make them level. Goodness is a plumb line that we want to try to get right if we want to make our evolution moral and heading toward this direction of greater perfection. But of course, this idea of perfection smacks of theism, to many people. And so it's anathema because they're clinging to this materialistic worldview, for not only self-defining reasons and loyalty to their worldview reasons, but also because their grants depend on it. So unleashing the idea of perfection as a gradual movement and being able to claim the direction of evolution as something that does have a spiritual dimension to it, and understand that this social ontology, the intersubjectivity, is one of the key areas we can begin to understand and see what's going on. I think that's one of the most exciting edges of development in this philosophical community we're in.
Gregg, I've got a couple questions for you, but is there anything about all that you want to say first?
I mean, for me, the way I sort of break down in terms of these evolution of justification systems, and then the problems of justification that I see, and then what's happening is evolution is differentiating in particular ways, and in terms of the ways in which we explain what is. So I think of the evolution, for example, the emergence of the Greeks, especially Socrates into Plato into Aristotle, and the development of what I would call formal epistemology with Socrates, where he says, hey, maybe we're all just BSing, basically. A lot of this is just pragmatic, social, conventional knowledge, but underneath it, when you learn the Socratic questioning method, the epistemological foundations upon which you're making knowledge claims is a lot weaker, and thus he is the wise man by not knowing anything. I think that that's an evolutionary shift, a big shift in traditional philosophical systems. I think that science creates a particular shift also. I think the science gets points for understanding sort of description and explanation of various kinds of systems of justification. I think its methodology is built for that kind of element. I think that's really key. I also think then that unfortunately it sort of splits is and ought in problematic ways, takes value in philosophy outside and then says, here's your natural science account of things. Yet it's got to be married back in, I believe. So as I listen to Steve's comments there, what I'm hearing there is this sort of a big worldview narrative that has both scientific logos, and then I would want to say, okay, well, there's a natural science version of reality that has particular kinds of commitments, and then we want to bridge that to a mythos, and I mean that in the best sense of the term, meaning a shared understanding of our place in the universe, and the kind of truth commitments are a little different when I'm in a mythic frame of mind. So if I listen to your comment in terms of move towards perfection as a myth, as a mythos, as a cultivation of what ought to be, I feel very much in line with that. We may have some slight ontological differences at some point, but I feel strongly aligned with that vision, wisdom-wise, in terms of what we
Sure,
can
and
gather.
it'd be fun over a beer sometime. We're not making media that goes on YouTube to kind of unpack that a little bit more. But I want to come back to something you just said regarding differentiation, right? So that's another way of thinking about this science's conception of the movement of evolution toward complexity. But we've known since Herbert Spencer that evolution is moving towards differentiation and then integration, often by steps.
Yep.
And that is in a sense the reason that I see G.W.F. Hegel as in a sense what Plato is for modernist consciousness. He's like the avatar, of proto-modernism. Hegel is integral consciousness. He's sort of the proto-integralist.
I could see that.
He feels the Richard Dreyfuss mashed potato drive because he's he's the first to try to identify the structure of emergence, which he framed as affirmation, negation, and then negation of the negation, or as we normally put it, thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Sure.
And that's another model of differentiation and integration, and it relates back to what I said about complexity and unity being these two legs. But there's always a third, right? There's always the negation of the negation of the synthesis, or the consciousness, which emerges increasingly through this process of differentiation and complexification and unification, et cetera. And all of that, I would say, is strong evidence that we live in a finite universe that's contained within the infinite, that this pattern of emergence is reflecting in a self-similar microcosmic way at every step the structure of the whole, which is infinite and finite. And so I think this highly theological idea of there's this finite universe and it's contained within the infinite universe. There's evidence for that in the very structure of emergence itself at every micro step. So I think that's one of the mind-boggling tasks we have before us as we're mapping this structure of emergence is to bring in this element of self-similarity, the micro and the macro reflecting each other across scale.
I love fractals across scale.
Yeah, it's a clear feature of this structure, but our minds are too puny, and so obviously there's way more than the consciousness we're holding in our bodies right now as we're having this conversation is allowed by the cultural stage that we're entering into now. Agreed. But that is itself, by definition, it's giving us, a platform or horizon of discourse, while we know that in the future we'll break out of that, just like a chick hatches from an egg, right? And then we'll be, our culture will allow us to have a much more sophisticated conception of what we're talking about. But at least we can begin in this moment to say, look, we're entering in a new platform and we've got a new horizon of justification or membrane of it.
Absolutely. So
let's make the most of it.
Amen. That I'm all in.
The concept of consciousness has come up a few times. Jake mentioned it in an embodied sense. Steve mentioned the Teilhard de Chardin kind of view where consciousness and complexity are co-evolving through these stages of big history. What do you mean by consciousness when you think about it, Gregg? And can wisdom develop unconsciously?
Okay, great question. Actually, John Vervaeke and I are just wrapping up a 15-part series on untangling the world knot of consciousness as we approach it from my human psychological vantage point, and he approaches it from his integrative cognitive science view. So for me, we want to kind of start with matter, which I'm not a panpsychic person. Just a basic, the material layer, which I think is devoid of conscious awareness at any level. You then get into the living layer, which I believe has a subjective proto-cognition, but that's very similar to like what your gut does as it metabolizes food. In other words, it doesn't have what we would, when we humans talk about conscious, like, are you conscious? Hey, can you hear that? And can you feel that? And what's the difference between when you're awake and when you're asleep? There is then the experiential or phenomenological meaning of consciousness. That is that interior experience of the screen of awareness, the experience of a witness function that has an episodic memory structure that then identifies self as differentiated from the world. John and I are of the opinion that first, what happens in the animal kingdom is what's called the emergence of valence qualia, like pleasure and pain that serve as fundamental broadcast functions. These are sort of the early elements of animal consciousness. Then those broadcast functions serve as a way to bring a global attention of the neuronal workspace. That gives rise to the screen of experience and the phenomenological witnessing function, which I believe would be present in things like crows and mammals and maybe down into fish. We're not really, it's a very, very complicated question. And we're in the, you have what I call the epistemological gap. That's how do you look at some other creature's consciousness? What is it like to be a bat from Nagel? You have that mystery. But then you move up. And so I call that, by the way, I call mind one, the neurocognitive functional view, where we're basically what some people call the simple problems of consciousness. It's how do you be functionally aware and how do we understand that without necessarily getting into subjectivity? Then there's the emergence of mind two. And then the third mind is our self-conscious, self-reflecting mind. So here I am deciding to come onto this wonderful opportunity and share my version of reality and justify why my unified theory kicks ass, woohoo. Okay. And so now that is human cultural conscious, where there's a stage of justification that's operating. We create a constraints and frame on that. We have self-explicit narrative, and my system provides a frame for those domains and then the dynamic interrelation between them. And I certainly believe, and I think this is very consistent with Steve, we're at and many of us are feeling that the evolution of modernity has reached a particular stage It's showing its wear in a particular way. We got to a particular stage. We're in the process really of a transformation. And I think we're in the process of a cusp of a transformation in cultural consciousness. I think there's a lot of different forces that are happening. And I think that conversations like these to elevate the narrative and to create a collective distributed network of understanding, if we do that right, we can transform towards perfection, to use Steve's terms there.
The future is here, it's just not evenly distributed.
Steve, I want to probe a little bit into how you think of perfection, because it seems like there's a couple of basic options, right? There's perfection in a sense already exists and we're moving toward it. There's things are just getting a little better over time as we get better at adapting to whatever circumstances we're in. We're approximating some optimal adaptation. Or there's a sense in which it's like a fractal. And even though it isn't one thing, the same pattern of perfection repeats and repeats and repeats all over. So I don't know if those are entirely clear. Are we just getting better? Is there something which is perfect? Or is there a kind of patterning that we could call perfect that repeats massively throughout the system at different scales?
Sure. Well, that's an excellent question. I mean, I want to hear your answer to that question.
Give us the perfect answer to that, Layman.
I mean, first of all, let me just lament that the word perfection is problematic, because immediately people think of it as a static state, like something that's perfect. There's no opportunity for further evolution. So maybe if we think of perfecting, as a verb rather than a noun, right? That it's a direction of wholeness, or a direction of goodness, or a direction of, insert your favorite value there, right? But the idea that the universe, that things can get better in real terms, that it's not, that what's better depends on our judgment to make it so, but it's not completely, that's necessary but not sufficient to understand what we mean by this direction of greater perfection. And so, I mean, for purposes of science and politics and filling out the current paradigm that's just emerging now, then we can certainly allow for placeholders with the understanding that this term opens up into the mystery that will take humanity thousands of years, if ever, to fully unpack. So I don't want to put too much weight on the term perfecting or perfection, but what I want to suggest is that if the finite really is contained and held within something bigger, something more infinite, something eternal, right? And if time definitely has a container, and if we can conceive, just like you're not supposed to ask what was before the Big Bang, it's like what's asking what's north of the North Pole, but that's a form of reductionism. If science can't explain it, then don't ask, right? But if we conceive of this idea that there's the finite universe is surrounded by this concept placeholder, which we can call the infinite, and the idea that we're being drawn toward that state of affairs in time, then we can begin to understand that human consciousness, that our free will, or relatively more free than animal will, that is in a sense an organ of perception for value. So that we're perceiving value, that crack of freedom that exists in between the determinism of our biology and the determinism of our culture, right? These giant things that are, thinking our thoughts for us. In between those huge forces of history and nature, there's just a little bit of freedom. And as we evolve our consciousness, that freedom grows. Our free will becomes more free, as Maslow understood. So what is that freedom? It's like one way of understanding it. It's just a crack in the fabric of the finite that lets the light of the infinite shine in. And that's what an experience of value is. It's a momentary glimpse of the presence of the infinite in the finite, in our minds. But the only reason that it's not entirely subjective is it only becomes real when we perfect the universe incrementally. That is something good when we not only experience it, it's good, but when it makes things better, when it serves someone or something. So that's a way of beginning to get our arms around how this slippery thing called value, or the direction of evolution, can be both objective and subjective, neither entirely, both are brought together. And it's that process of subjective and objective unification continuously by steps that moves the finite forward toward greater states of perfection. So anyway, that's a mouthful, but that's at least,
It's a pretty good answer.
trying to say some things around what you asked.
I'm going to hold my own views on the telos of perfection in abeyance for the purposes of this conversation. Gregg, how do you hold the notion of development and progress with the idea that our ancestors, in some senses, might have been more wise than we are?
Absolutely.
Is it fundamentally a development, or are there ways in which we might have left behind the great gates to wisdom?
No, I enjoyed your conversation with Mark Edwards a little while ago. He brought up some of his experiences with indigenous wise elders in Australia that really resonated with me. I think we are in danger of, one of the things I empathize with, because I can feel it, see it. They're definitely in a cultural conscious, like second tier consciousness that resonates. But I think it's also setting some stage up for pride in a way that is dangerous. I think that wisdom is a very, very complicated issue, and it's going to be fundamentally dependent upon certain kinds of values that you emphasize. I did a lot of analysis on this concept of well-being. What is well-being? And I argued that although there are some key features of well-being, for example, a subjective experience of satisfaction and happiness, good functioning, and an environment that's safe and secure and allows for growth, those kinds of elements. It also then is an alignment that requires a particular evaluative reflection. That is, the evaluator needs to make some decisions in relationship to it. And when you look at certain contexts, it depends enormously about which values are you going to emphasize. So for example, if we're going to emphasize connection with the earth, which is something I would value, a deep, oral, relational, intimate experience of being known and valued in a particular group and community, and embracing that, which I would say you could then see how a particular oral indigenous lifestyle is richer and more fulfilling than a broken, isolated, high-tech world. And then at the same time, my son 2 weeks ago had a massive emergency appendicitis. And then you say, well, okay, I'm glad we're in a and I could take him to a hospital, and 2 weeks later he can be really healthy rather than have that thing pop or have a serious arm injury all of a sudden. So the value, when you actually do value analysis, it's a very, very rich and textured domain. I think that there are then fundamental kinds of frames of understanding of knowledge and ways of being that allow us to extract better and clearer visions of how we might be. And so I would be hesitant about making blanket statements about moving toward progress. I think anybody that sees the ups and downs of civilization would be hesitant about that. But there is a trajectory and a potentiality and an opportunity, I think, for living better and better lives. I look out across the horizon of what I feel we're on the cusp of, and frankly, I see heaven and hell on the edge of what we're on the edge of. And it seems very clear to me that we better think seriously about our values in a particular way and get together and share our authentic selves with good reflection and honor and move toward a better world, and be both humble but not overly relativistic about those assertions.
Seems like there might have been circumstances historically that favored people's ability to wisely adapt to the biosphere and noosphere that they were encountering, and that we might not have the same degree of adaptation in our current circumstance, but that if we could get that degree of adaptation, then we might have a richer, more valuable, wiser situation than they did. That puts me in mind of the cultural processes, the intersubjective processes that people use in order to teach each other how to adapt to the biosphere and noosphere that exists for them.
Yes.
Which brings me to education. And Steve, what's your fantasy, or what do you think is missing, or what could we add to our educational processes to help accelerate people's growth toward a more value-rich environment?
Well, it's funny that you ask that, because one of the things I'm doing now is the work with the Institute for Cultural Evolution think tank, is the board and I agreed that we needed to come up with a post-progressive platform. Like what's our position on this issue and this issue, and then what are our solutions? And although, we don't want to try to be dilettantes or try to pretend to be policy wonks, and compete with people who've devoted 40 years of their life to understanding these particular issues, I think we can say, look, here's an example of something that might work, right? Here's our framework. We're seeking win-win-win on these issues, right? And so I wrote something on climate change, something on immigration, something on healthcare. Now I'm writing something on education. And oh my God, smoke's coming out of my ears, because the problems of education are the problems of the society in a way. And so, how do you wrestle with poverty in the home and its impact on K through 12 education? Well, you have to deal with the evolution of consciousness and people being stuck at pre-traditional. And I mean, it's a can of worms, but I'm trying to wrestle with it. But I think that one of the things that we've seen in the evolution of education is that we went from religious education, parochial education, right? Then we had this emergence of philosophies of education with Dewey and and other philosophers of the 20th century, and there was this great emergence of a kind of a secular norm, right? That we wanted to have a separation of church and state, and where the rubber met the road was in school. Right, so we outlawed school prayer, and when there's now like where my kids go to school in public education, there's a huge allergy toward anything that you can't hand out Easter cards, right? Because that's the violation of the separation of church and state. So I'm more argue with secular modernity's attempts to keep religion at bay, but now we're in a situation where we have these competing moral systems, right? There's the traditional moral system, which is on the wane. But we have this progressive moral system. Although it's not a religion, it's operating as a moral system. And there's this tug of war for the soul or the allegiance of modernity that we see, in our current age. And so in education, I think just as we need a separation of church and state to preserve the container of secular modernity to do its job, we also need to have a similar bracketing of this competing progressive moral system, which modernity has no defense mechanisms for. So in the same way that we developed a healthy separation between church and state, we now need to develop a healthy separation between critical theory and state, so that the moral system of progressivism doesn't just completely eliminate any claims to secularity that modernity may have, right? But that brings us back to this question of wisdom, right? Because if the proponents of critical theory and intense postmodern progressivism, they see this as a major moral advance, and indeed it is. It has a lot of characteristics that make it more wise, that make it more inclusive, that make it an authentic extension of the structure of emergence. But as we were talking about earlier, there's this, as Habermas identified, this constant dialectic of progress and pathology. That as we make progress, new and even gnarlier pathologies emerge, which means we have to keep evolving. Because, even though, traditionalism had these horrible pathologies of the Inquisition and torture and, oppression, it never threatened to wipe out the biosphere like modernity. And just like, progressivism has all of these important, this important layer of care that includes the marginalized and the environment and all these things we definitely need to include and value better if we're going to advance to another level of civilization. But that same advance, that same degree of progress brings the threat of undermining everything we've achieved from the beginning. That is wiping out modernity, invalidating all of the important platform accomplishments of traditionalism. So there is a new pathology, and many people are beginning to see it now, with the intensity of the rejectionism and the tyranny, or the underside of the progressive worldview. And that's a beautiful thing, because that very pathology, those very threats, are the points of departure that allow us to conceive of a wider spectrum of value that can appreciate progressivism, but also better integrate it with the best of what came before. So let me just say that we've talked a lot about value and its direction. I want to talk a little bit more about wisdom, right? Because that was, sort of what we gathered to think and talk about. I would love to hear both of you guys' definition of wisdom. Obviously, it's a term that's unwieldy and it can be defined in different ways. We don't want to make it stand still because it's moving. But I've always, in my life, I always thought of wisdom in simplistic terms as the synthesis of wisdom of knowledge and experience, right? That the people who are wise are people who have, a lot of knowledge, but knowledge without the necessary experience can, truncate the wisdom. Likewise, if all you've got of experience with no knowledge, then you may not be taking advantage of all the wisdom you can get. But when you have this wisdom, it's the ability to discern values within the frame that you're in. And the frame that we're moving into now allows us to go back and understand the wisdom of the, Aboriginal elders in Australia and see how that their wisdom is something that we need now. We just need to carry forward, the dignities of that without the disasters that go with living in the Stone Age. So, I'd love to have us unpack the definition of wisdom a little bit more.
Yeah, let's get into wisdom. I just want to check in with Gregg and see if there's anything you wanted to add to the idea of how our educational systems generally need to be modified in order to encourage a more valuable and wiser society.
Okay.
Small topic.
So, this is I'm a big fan of Zach Stein. He talks about education in its time between worlds. I think that, and thinks about it broadly, our socialization into worldview. And of the things that make me very nervous, but also a big fan of like what Steve is doing, is the task before us, both in terms of where our school systems and our society is, and how chaotic it is, and how much we need to move very quickly, which, by the way, why it's so important for people to be able to come together that are seeing the mountain and then realize don't differentiate based on small differences, get together. To give you, I live in Stuart Strath, Virginia. When my kids were in a public school, they sat behind while the other kids went just outside the school thing, and every once a week for a half an hour had weekly religious education, which taught them as long as they believed in Christ, they will go to heaven, else they're going to hell. This is in a public school, okay, where about 50% of the people in my neighborhood would not believe in evolution at all. And then you have, what do we actually teach people in relationship to how do we socialize them? So we are facing, because there's traditionalists in rural communities, there's a massive traditionalism that's terrified about modern science taking away their version of God, yet alone a postmodern version of reality that then says love Mother Earth and go into globalism and give up your white identity. We have such remarkable different versions of reality. And now with the internet and everything else, allowing people to live in different worlds, okay, that the ability to come together and have a socialization of our children to a shared identity that then at least allows them to do what they need to do is just an enormous problem that I find it to be. When I'm feeling my more pessimistic, the fact of the state of the planet, the state of our weapons, and the state of our knowledge and education those are the days that I have trouble getting out of bed. But thankfully I manage, but it can be scary that way. I then can come back to, well, how are we possibly going to awaken in this, say, necessary 30-year period to get the system, to get our cultural consciousness up with the digital age and the globalization reality and our knowledge systems. And I look to Steve's work and I say, yes, we need to have serious conversations about values, okay? Because what actually is wisdom, they just did a conference, Science of Wisdom. It's actually, let's step back, let's reflect, okay? So that's what we do in psychotherapy. It's like, let's be aware, let's get a metacognitive view of the situation we're in. Instead of mindlessly reacting, we're gonna get a metacognitive view. We're going to then reflect deeply on what we care about, what is our foundational values, and then we're going to apply our thinking to become toward valued states of being. So anchor to being, recognize what you're doing from a metacognitive perspective, then think about value-based ways of becoming going forward. For me, the question is, can we cultivate those kinds of conversations? I think if we cultivate those kinds of conversations, the remarkable, as long as we map it out, the remarkable opportunity for so much shared value, okay? I walk around, I talk to my neighbors, 75% who vote for Trump, I'll have a conversation with them. They're wonderful, lovely people, right? Okay? Walking their dog just like anybody else. At the same time, you drop into what might be happening in our political system, and you're a couple of steps from such an unbelievable fracture and division of the system. How's it going to work? And then what would happen, right? So we need a lot of efforts towards, a political, educational awakening a lateral move away from the polarization of positions that people are trying to justify, which do anchor into different mindsets. How we can wake up, and I think one way to wake up is to focus on the bedrock values that we might reflect on. I think we would find a lot of commonality there. And I think if we can start building educational systems in reference to those, then we can start cultivating a wiser way of being in this world, and move toward the meter toward heaven instead of, at times I fear, the other direction.
Layman, let me just jump in there and comment on what Gregg just said, because first of all, bravo. I really love the way you put that. I think we could get even more concrete and say that public education, K through 12 education, I mean, let's bracket higher education for the moment. Just say that there's a huge need and a new opportunity to bring in morality or virtues or values, or even Howard Gardner, who's a staunch secularist, right, at the Harvard Education School, multiple intelligence guy. He has his book, Truth, Beauty, and Goodness Reframed, came out a few years ago, where he argues that the good, the true, and the beautiful ought to be the aims of education, across the curriculum, and that there ought to be a dimension of the good, the true, and the beautiful in every subject. And I love that idea. I also love the idea of bringing in virtues. It could come in within a secular frame through positive psychology, as I argue in developmental politics. But I think more importantly, I think one of the key things that could really help sort out not only the culture war within education, but the culture war within the body politic, is this idea of cultural intelligence, right? It's both simple, applicable leadership skill, but it also gets extremely complex all the way up to integral consciousness and the full implications of what that means. So just being able to understand, a degree of plurality regarding these different worldviews and see how they've all got positive values and they've all got negatives, and we can adopt an authentic position that's outside and above all three. If we could just do that, there'd be so many problems that could be solved, which is, why that's what we're focusing on at the Institute for Cultural Evolution as, one of our main thrusts.
Amen. The one thing I would add to yours is what Lean Rachel Anderson adds in Metamodernity is also the embrace of the oral indigenous sensibility. And that I think there are ways that just would weave right into that in terms of the three, cultural consciousness, and then embracing people's subjective, relational, embodied ways of being in the world. But that's exactly the kind of lateral move that we need to do, and find ways into, get us together. That's sort of like, yes, it's fine. There's some minor issues, but we can all agree that there's a shortage of wisdom and value energy that we can disperse into the K through 12 educational system that would actually, that's necessary for all sorts of reasons.
Right. So let me just add really quickly that in developmental politics, I focus on those three major worldviews just to make it conceivable to somebody, Right. Of course, in integral consciousness, I explore the entire spiral: tribal, what I call warrior consciousness, pre-traditional consciousness, and there's wisdom in both of those pre-traditional stages that we need to carry forward. Indeed, that's how this idea of going back, it starts at Green, right? It starts at the progressive level. They begin to see all this tribal wisdom. They adopt a tribal aesthetic, right? Burning Man is one big tribal festival, right? So the job of reintegrating the wisdom that we've lost from the past begins at progressivism, but I think, it expands into getting the wisdom of the entire spiral online. And so for purposes of,
that made, right. Absolutely. Made 100% hear you.
All right, well, let's come back to what is wisdom. And personally, I have sort of three general working definitions. My first definition is the degree to which the integration of subsystems is present within those systems. So, like you produce numinous integrated experience by weaving together your subjective systems to create a harmony that's greater than the parts, but then the patterns of that can be reflected in those parts. So your overall being, the degree to which it shows up in your behavior or your emotions or your thinking, is the degree to which your knowledge and being are fused. You're wise under those conditions. Sometimes I think of it as like a self-hack, that we have these basic skills that allow us to learn by adapting to environments. And some of those skills are intentionality and reflection. And the more intentionality and reflection are added in, the more our learning procedure becomes a developmental, ongoing learning procedure that starts to deviate from just regular knowledge and skill adaptation. And then the third way I think about it is value adjudication, where we're always involved in pursuing values of some kind, but both the sages and the philosophers, who have been our great exemplars of wisdom, they compare the relationships between values, right? Whether it's bringing values together, or whether it's which one to choose in a given circumstance, or whether it's letting them fight, or, there's all kinds of things that are equivalent to logic gates in computation, right? What are the structures of the relationships between values, and the people who are analyzing that and trying to enact it are then the wise. So those are my three top of mind takes on that. What about you, Gregg? What's your general definition of value, of wisdom?
I love that. I think about it. I found it to be very consolidating, basically a metacognitive view grounded in value that does valued states of being. My own version of that is cultivated at the character level. And so in relationship to how do you instantiate that at the, you think about behavior as a function of person and environment. So what do you bring to the table, and how do you create then stable virtues that then cultivate valued states of being and grow in that way? I think about it in terms of the internalization of the sage. So that's the particular metacognitive view that you then step outside of. In fact, the 8th branch on the tree talks about the cultivation of calm MO. That's a metacognitive observer that you then develop as a modus operandi to be activated when you're engaged in things that are, value laden, especially if you get value laden with conflict, either intrapsychic or interpersonally. And then it cultivates a particular set of attitudes that is curious. So you want to gain knowledge. That's accepting rather than resisting and reacting. That's loving, compassionate in terms of your basic values, and then motivated toward valued states of being, which is then taking into consideration how you might be. And then another way in which I think about it is Nick Maxwell is somebody who has a philosopher who argues that the mode of the academy has been captured by knowledge, and in particular then scientific knowledge as the sort of the epitomized goal. And he makes a very good point, I think, that ultimately knowledge also needs to be tied, what is, and in the embodied existence of our being needs to be tied to what ought to be. And that's a very important dialectic. And although we can cut off some of that through certain kinds of processes of justification and epistemologies, it's always embedded. And then ultimately, existence is always what's, and is an ought conglomerate, which means then we have to be figuring constantly what are our aims, what are our values in terms of our cultural intelligence. And therefore, so now we're at the higher order level of making salient what are our values, both currently and what ought to they be, and how do we manifest them. So there's that then macro level cultural consciousness and what we try to embody in that regard.
Sounds wise to me.
I think one more thing came up for me, which is that wisdom has a corrective element to it. One of my heroes when I was a kid was Robert Anton Wilson, and I met him, and he said, the only way you know you're getting any wiser is you're constantly realizing how foolish you've been until now. Right? So there's this relational corrective thing. And a lot of the practices that we think develop wisdom are also the practices that counteract our implicit bias structures and the things that show up when our value system runs into problems with somebody else's value system. So we run into conflict and we have to correct for that discrepancy. So I think there's a very corrective and plastic adaptive function. I think
I love that.
With some of what Hegel was saying too, because you run into the conflict and then the new emergence has to correct for that tension somehow.
So, one of the things that in the unified theory it says is the evolution of our self-consciousness, human, primate to person self-consciousness is this ego thing, and it's a mental organ of justification. And its set point is to try to justify your interest of yourself and whatever you determine your group to be. That's its biased set point, and it jams your self-centered stuff into your shadow and allows you to see everybody else as a BSer as you experience yourself as speaking truth. Okay, and so what does that mean? Is like, well, it means you better cultivate the context that maybe you're the BSer. right? And then learn over time to take ownership of that. That gets back to the die again, die better kind of notion of constantly being like, yes, in what way are you, orienting yourself to bias the version of reality you have, to assert your interests, try to solve the personal problem and take your bigger piece of the pie, which at a collective communal level, we know from the hunter-gatherers, what is one thing they really regulate? Narcissistic dominance. And that's wise to do. And I think we all can engage in that collectively a little better than we seem to exemplify with some of our politics these days.
Right. Let me jump in and say that obviously, wisdom is a fabulous concept because it's such a many splendored thing. There are so many different ways to get at it, and it's always moving. And and whenever you feel like you've got a grip on it, if you're wise, you'll say, well, that's not it, right? But I think one of the ways we can unpack that is what I try to do in Chapter 8 of Developmental Politics, and that is tease apart a little bit these concepts of virtue and value. Right. And so I say that, values are heading, it's a direction of where we're going. But virtue as a concept is sort of it's the quality of who we are, right? The habits of the heart, our character. And of course, wisdom is not only a value, and it's not only an evaluative process, it's also a virtue, right? So the closest of the 7 fundamental virtues from the Catholic Catechism or from Aristotle, prudence. Right, a stodgy term, but the modern English translation that people like best is practical wisdom, right? But then, of course, we say, okay, well, wisdom's more than prudence, right? That prudence is a species of wisdom. But then we have, Aristotle's fabulous mystical saying that there's only one virtue, right? That we may break it out as, prudence and temperance and courage and justice and, hope and faith and love, but ultimately. It's more a matter of the quality of your being, right? The quality of your consciousness as it's resonating with its job in the cosmic economy, which is to grow spiritually. At least I would argue. So, wisdom is, this virtue of wanting to grow, of consolidating the growth that we've achieved, but always being humble about, another virtue. About the more growth that's yet to be achieved. And so understanding that it flips back and forth between value and virtue and encompasses them both, our concept overflows with more meaning than it can hold.
Yep. And for me, there's the person and person environment behavioral pattern. In context, I would also want to say we want to know that, you carry this, but as we can all see in different contexts, our states will fluctuate, right? So that allows us to, the way you described it there, as a virtue, which is more of a stage and a characteristic, but then also, what calls you in what moment, what challenges do you have, what's this, the immediate environmental state you're in. I love the value, virtue, and wisdom as a bridge between those.
I just want to jump in, maybe we can cut this off, but I need to wrap it up soon because I have a parent-teacher conference. Speaking of education.
Speaking of education. All right.
My 14-year-old.
You talking about 5 minutes or are you talking about 15 minutes?
5 minutes, I think.
All right.
If that's okay with you.
Well, I like the virtue-value distinction. I'd probably say the virtue is maybe, the functional tendency to take action in ways that involve the interactions between values. Right.
Say that again. I'm sorry. Say that one more time.
The tendency to function in ways that take multiple values into account. Right. So you're going to ride a horse. Are you going to control the horse or are you going to let the horse go? Those are two different values you could bring to the situation. But riding the horse is a way of causing the negotiation between those two values to be operative in the same action.
Nice analogy.
But if you only got a couple of minutes, is there anything left we want to say? Anything still on your mind, Steve, Greg?
Well, let me just say, I think let's have another one of these because, we're in some ways we're just getting started, but it's also good to make, media that's not 3 hours long. And we've all got things going on, but maybe we can have a bridge to another dialogue.
Absolutely. Well, I think to me, I know you've been cultivating value energy for a long time, and I sort of tweaked. I've been working on wisdom and then wisdom energy for a long time. I think that when we just talk about values and virtues. And in fact, I have a thing called a wheel of character development that has different domains. And one of them is called value and virtue. And so then that channeling and the idea that we can channel it, the idea that we need to channel it, there's a necessity that we have, modeling how we have different systems that can also come together in integrative pluralism, but then really share, wow, look at how much remarkable overlap. And then as we look out, yes, how could we actually distribute this and cultivate value, wisdom, energy moving forward? It feels to be a lot of possibilities here that have a lot of synergy.
Indeed. Concepts, we can only take them so far. At some point, like I said, we've got these words and they're blending together. They're challenging each other. They're overflowing with meaning. But, it's in the process of this crucible of taking language as far as we can take it and seeing where it starts to, lose its effectiveness. And we can all just, stare each other in the eyes and hold hands and go, there's something deeper than language could ever get to. But it's good to talk and it's good to philosophize, and I think we're getting somewhere. And so I'm looking forward to doing some more.
Right.
Well, yeah, let's call this part 1, and we'll pick up part 2 at some point in the future. And I'll keep in mind that we left off at virtue mediating between value and wisdom.
Perfect.
Okay. Sounds good.
That somehow works well. That's close to perfection as far as I'm concerned.
You're a wise man, Pascal.
I'm wise enough not to deny that when people say
yeah, just don't cling to it.
Right.
It's a becoming thing.
It's a state and becoming dynamic.